So welcome everyone to another session of the data learning seminars. Today we have Sara Beery from, at the moment she's doing a postdoc in Google. She completed her PhD in Caltech in 2022, and she's an incoming assistant professor at MIT. And today she'll be speaking about her project with Auto Arborist. So Sara, I'll leave the audience with you.
Hi everyone, it's nice to meet you. I was just saying to Cesar, but I'm very open to you guys asking questions throughout. I know this is a pretty broad audience, or at least that's what I've heard. So if you want more technical detail, or if you want more explanation of something technical, like please interrupt me. I'm happy to have that be kind of more of a back and forth. And yeah, I'm going to be talking sort of hammering in on urban forest mapping as a case study, but I think I'm going to start by sort of more broadly discussing the ways that we've been thinking about or learning about or working on large-scale ecosystem and biodiversity monitoring, and how computer vision and machine learning has a role to play there. So just as sort of a first motivating aspect of this discussion, you know, depending on the audience I'm speaking to, this is either old news or kind of surprising, but biodiversity is in pretty catastrophic decline. A lot of people are terming this era that we're currently living in the 6th mass extinction, and we're actually losing species at a faster rate than during the last extinction of the dinosaurs. And so if you're looking at this plot over here, you can actually see that not only are we losing species, but it's really across the taxonomic tree that we're starting to see almost exponential growth in species extinctions. And then beyond that, we're not just losing species, we're actually just losing population of the species that we still have. So we've lost, actually this number's now been updated to 69% on average of our just wildlife populations worldwide. So that's pretty major. And I think it's important to note that like biodiversity isn't just sort of this abstract concept of like, oh, it's so nice to go outside and see all these different beautiful plants and animals. It's actually something that's really intrinsically tied to a lot of things that really matter for us as a society. Biodiversity is intrinsically tied to climate change. Recent work has been showing more and more how not just like carbon sequestration in trees, but actually the active participation of a lot of these different underground species, everything from moles to microbiome, like microbes, are really driving the conversion of carbon from the air into the soil, which is like now a much more stable and longer life cycle of carbon sequestration. Biodiversity is tied to public health. Restrictions in biodiversity and restrictions in population sizes lead to animal populations that are more susceptible to disease. And restriction in habitat then means that we have more interaction between human and wildlife, which leads to the spread of zoonotic diseases in our populations, things like COVID. Biodiversity is tied to food security. There's been recent work showing that actually not just that we need pollinators, but we actually need diverse pollinators to be able to get maximal nutrition out of our food. If you only have a single type of pollinator, there's less nutrition in the food as a result. And then it's tied to ecosystem services, things like, for example, how the urban forest and how plants are really very important for stability of soil. And so as we're seeing more catastrophic weather events, things like landslides and erosion are more and more of a problem when you have less strong and diverse plant ecosystems stabilizing your soil. There's just a few examples, but these things are very important and increasingly important for our generation. And so I've sort of really leaned into trying to understand how do we really scale up our understanding and our ability to maybe mitigate this biodiversity loss in the next 50 to 100 years. And so how do we think about scaling up environmental monitoring with AI? So there's a really diverse set of data that's being collected in real time around the globe about the environment, everything from satellite imagery, low-flying aircraft or drones, on animal sensors, so things like biologging, where you're actually tracking animals over time and using animals as sensors for things like ocean temperature and acidification. Stationary sensors like networks of camera traps, which are motion triggered stable cameras, or bioacoustic sensors or sonar. And then an increase in what's called community science data. So I don't know if any of you have used iNaturalist, for example, but these community-driven participatory data collection repositories where you can go out and take pictures of what you see in your own backyard, in your own neighborhood, and those get identified to species by the community and then translated into records in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF. But what we found is, like, in order to actually make use of this data, in order to actually translate these huge amounts of raw data into something that's building ecological insight and actually leading to action, we need to figure out how to learn from it. And so a lot of the work that we've done, myself and a lot of my colleagues, is trying to figure out how to learn from imperfect data, because these data are imperfect. They can be biased, they can be very noisy, and they're almost always very long-tailed, which means that the vast majority of the data we collect is of only a few very common species. And then in that very long tail, we end up with lots and lots and lots of species that are seen very rarely. And so you can't ignore that few-shot learning problem, or that sparse data problem, when you're trying to build machine learning systems that do this reliably and robustly. And digging a little bit more into that bias, we also really see that there are pretty major domain shifts or distribution shifts around the world as the world is changing sort of seasonally, but then also due to climate change year to year. So we really need to be able to build systems that can handle or adapt to distribution shift, to generalize out of domain. And just even one way to look at that here, if you look on the left, this is an estimate of global biodiversity and what we call alpha diversity, which is just the number of unique species. You can see that most of the unique species, most of the biodiversity on Earth is in the subequatorial tropics. We actually look at the data that we have, that the entire ecological, biological, scientific communities, zoological, have collected over the last 100 years. It's all being sort of ported into, or much of it is being ported into GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. You can see there's a huge bias in that data towards the US, Europe, some of Australia, these countries that have kind of a history of being very well funded, well resourced, but actually are not where the biodiversity is on Earth. So we have to be able to handle distribution shift in our data as well as distribution shift in our underlying systems. And then so another big area of work that I've worked on and others is, how do we both measure and then improve that type of domain generalization under distribution shift, so that we can really get models that can be usable anywhere on Earth across the taxonomic tree. And then finally, this is just another example of one of the types of work that we do. A lot of these sensors are in very remote environments, right? This is looking at multi-object tracking, detecting and tracking and then counting fish, in particularly salmonids, for escapement estimation. So if you're the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, you're managing a $4 billion a year fishing industry, you get to decide in near real time when to enable or restrict commercial fishing. And what you need to do is ensure that enough of the populations have escaped upstream so that they can regenerate, respawn, and that you have a stable population year to year. And what we find is that not only now do we need to have these things be reliable, to be able to generalize to new rivers, we also find that we really need to try to work with the fact that these machine learning models will never be perfect, that human intelligence and sort of verification and quality control, particularly in high risk scenarios like this one, are very important. And so we have to build human AI participatory systems that enable us to scale more effectively and more reliably and work around the resource constraints we might have. So what processing happens on the edge, in a remote area of the Nushagak River, what under very limited bandwidth can be sent to central offices? How do we actually build not just computer vision models, but computer vision systems that we can rely on? And so, a few of the things that we've learned, some of the projects that we've done, is that rigorous experimental practices in computer vision really do enable impact. So when you're building a benchmark, trying to address a new challenge, it's very, very important that you're very careful and very honest about what your model is capable of and testing that model as it's intended to be used. So we put together like some initial benchmarks that were really some of the first in computer vision to explore domain shift or geospatial generalization. And we found that through that, we were actually able to determine what generalizes and what doesn't. So in this case, we're looking at trying to process static camera data, camera traps. There are hundreds of thousands of camera traps deployed worldwide. And we found that if we restrict the granularity of the task, if we just ask the models to detect and localize animals as opposed to categorizing to species, that model is then able to generalize to new species and new ecosystems that weren't seen during training pretty reliably. And so then we open source those models and we publish those so the community can use them because they're useful already while we continue to work on these hard, fine-grained distribution, like subpopulation distribution challenges in species classification. And by doing that, we find that, you get really diverse uses of these models, and they can be really impactful. So this model, the mega detector that I published with Microsoft AI for Earth, it's currently used by over 100 NGOs and governmental agencies worldwide, and it's really a fundamental part of the data processing pipeline for most people who work with camera trap data now. And so I'd really push for these communities to really think very carefully about rigorous experimental practices and how do we kind of measure the performance of models in as honest of a way as possible, as kind of use-oriented as possible, so that the claims we're making in our papers really do translate to impact. Second, we sort of learned that directly collaborating and incorporating domain expertise from the beginning with these projects tend to lead to the development of novel methods that actually do make significant gains on important problems. This is just one case of a model that we built for static sensors, things like camera traps, these sonar to new rivers, even things like traffic cameras, where we're able to incorporate very long-term temporal reasoning implicitly using attention, and we get really major gains in mean average precision just by really being inspired by the way that ecologists or these domain experts are actually learning from and interacting with their data. So we found that they really weren't able to do these tasks without temporal context and sometimes very long-term temporal context. And finally, we really find that by going beyond just a paper and actually actively deploying the methods we build in the field. So for example, this is a elephant re-identification system that we've deployed in Kenya. And it's been deployed there for 3 years. That enables us to move beyond static benchmarks, because a single static benchmark data set doesn't really capture the way that the world changes. And so if you've actually go to the process of deploying stuff, it gives you the ability to then explore how these models work and don't in a changing world in practice. And for me, because I'm so driven by the uses and the impact, this is very important. And really, really exploring the way that we think about human use of computer vision for solving specific problems. So, kind of the big goal here is we'd like to be able to monitor the environment and detect change across scales. So, everything from very small scale up to global scale, and then really around the world and in real time. And one case study, one way that we're currently looking at this is thinking about mapping urban forests. So I guess before I get into diving in on forests, does anyone have any questions about just sort of maybe like the broader picture of, where these two fields kind of intersect? Cool. If not, I'll just plow on. So, oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, there was just something that you mentioned a bit previous, and I just wanted to get some clarity. You said that you were using animals as sensors. Is that exclusively like as in like heat mapping and satellite imagery, or is there like some other inherent aspects that you're also using, like chemical changes within the body that you're then also mapping, or?
Oh yeah. So first I want to clarify. That's not like I am not developing these sensors. The ecological community has been increasingly interested in different ways to use animals as sensors. And it's not that they're actually monitoring, though sometimes they are, but most of the time they're not monitoring the animal themselves. They're putting a sensor on an animal and utilizing the fact, and this is very much the case in marine mammals, for instance, or different types of marine animals, they get much more kind of diverse information about ocean temperature or ocean salinity, because the animals are diving, like their behavior gives you this like more diverse, rich data. And then when they come to the surface, then that data can be transmitted. So it's like sort of using the fact that the animals are moving around in these environments that are difficult for us to explore. And so, yeah, it's kind of that type of thing is, I think, more common.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. And then you end up with all these other like statistical problems. Like, how do you take opportunistically sensed data from like dolphins and seals and kind of bring those together into a robust statistical model of ocean temperature, along with maybe these more stable sensors. And a lot of the animal tracking data I've been working with is more trying to understand wildlife behavior and community behavior and changes in that behavior. So can we understand how migrations are changing as climate changes, that type of thing. Cool. So urban forest. So I think a lot of you guys live in London. Am I correct? I mean, you know, if you're at Imperial, I'm guessing that's true. London is really up there in terms of like some of the sort of greenest cities on Earth. It has a lot of really amazing urban green space, and there's a lot of really awesome benefits that actually gives then to places like the City of London, where those things have been brought forward, even historically. So these urban forests do things like support regional biodiversity, so help support your native species. And they also reduce air pollution, they sequester carbon, they reduce energy use, and they also are really effective for urban heat islands, though I think that's something that people in the UK are a little bit less worried about than Los Angeles, where I've been living for the last few years. And they've been shown to have really positive benefits for both physical and mental health. But one of these things that is really true is that these benefits are not accessible to everyone. So this is an example from LA, where you can really see that Pasadena, here's California Institute of Technology, Caltech, is really green. It's one of the greener areas in Los Angeles. It's also incredibly wealthy and not very racially diverse. You move to somewhere like Carson, which is, you know, still within the greater Los Angeles area, much more diverse, much sort of lower socioeconomic profiles of the people who live there, way, way, way less access to all of those benefits coming from the urban forest. And I'm sure if you guys think about in London, going between different areas and different types of community demographics, you'll also, I'm sure, be able to think of shifts in the types of and the access to green space between those communities. And so there's been a lot of interest, I think, for urban planners in trying to understand actually how those things are playing out in real time, trying to understand where there are or aren't trees, and then be able to actually allocate resources to areas that have been historically under-resourced in terms of urban green space to try to actually build back and build more equity in that access. At Google, there's this urban ecology team that's been actually building and deploying these types of tree canopy maps now for over 500 cities globally, which is really amazing. And then they're able to work with, for example, in the US, nonprofits like Tree Equity Score that then take those canopy estimates and actually build explicit equity maps, like who does or does not have green space. And then these can be used to bring back to the city and lobby for improving the tree equity score in your city. But it turns out that for a lot of things, tree canopy prediction in and of itself, though useful, is not sufficient for the types of things that we want to understand about urban forests. So instance locations, actually counting individual and knowing the locations of individual trees, and then identifying them to species, are both necessary to improve things like estimated water retention of the urban forest, estimated carbon sequestration, particularly going forward, estimating potential heat reduction, being able to monitor those tree species reaction and resilience to changing climate, this becomes very important because we're really looking at, in the next 50 years, a pretty major shift in environmental covariates in all of our cities. And so the trees that thrive in New York City now, for example, may not really be might require a lot of management, a lot of extra water, a lot of extra care as we see the ecosystem and sort of the environment change. So they're estimating actually that the trees that thrive best now around North Carolina will actually be the species that will be best suited to New York's climate in about 50 years. So given that, we'd really like to be able to plant trees for the future, plant for climate resilience. And we don't really understand necessarily at scale what that looks like. And we'd also like to be able to strategically plan planting to maximize biodiversity. And a lot of that is actually kind of counter to what traditionally humans like. Like, we like symmetry. We think it's very beautiful when you have a street where it's like just lined with the same species of tree all the way down the street. Actually, I think the British were some of the original sort of like, oh, it's so pretty when everything's the same. And so, and then we've seen that really play out in a lot of the different, a lot of countries worldwide, that like emphasis on planting all one tree along one street. Turns out that's not really the best thing for biodiversity. It's probably better to have more diverse sets of trees along every street. But these tree inventories, like, so to be able to actually get information about tree locations and species, currently that's done usually by cities reaching out to contracting agencies, and they pay a lot of money for these. A single traditional census can cost up to $5 million. And that, because that's so expensive, a lot of cities actually have no clue what their urban forest is. They just have never been able to afford to do a census. So they just do not know where and what species of trees the city technically has ownership over. And they're just kind of always putting out fires, like a tree falls down and then the city is responsible for it. So then they go and try to deal with it, but they don't have any way to try to better manage their resources. Also means these, even if the city has invested in these, they can be really out of date. So a lot of the censuses we work with can be 10 years out of date, and trees don't change that much, but a lot of them will sort of die or new trees will be planted, and we want to be able to reflect those changes. And then they can be limited in scope, like maybe a certain neighborhood has actually come together and paid for a census in their area. But then that's not, again, sort of broader coverage. So what we want to try to do is automate urban tree censuses. How do we get the locations and the species of all the trees in all the cities on Earth? And there's been a good amount of pretty awesome prior work in finding and categorizing trees, and even doing that across data modalities. But basically what ends up happening is, like I talked about at the beginning, there is distribution shift. There are domain shifts and generalizability challenges in machine learning in the real world, kind of across the board in terms of application. And so these methods all work on cities they've been trained on, but they really struggle to generalize to cities that were not included in the training data set. And so what we're trying to figure out is there a way for us to scale to more cities with minimal additional labeling, trying to really increase access to this information. So one of the things that we've done in the last year or so is we tried to build and pull together a pretty large scale data set to enable us and others to study this problem. What can we do? What generalizes well? Can we actually figure out what the dimensions of the problem that lead to generalization or not are? And can we explore different methods to try to address that directly? And so this data set is 23 different cities across North America as a starting point, about 340 genera, 2.6 million tree records, and then 1 million trees with associated imagery. And then that imagery is both aerial imagery as well as imagery from Google Street View, so street level imagery. And what you're seeing here on the right is just going through that set of cities and looking at the 15 most common species, or maybe 20 most common genera of trees. So we have labels at the genus level, because the species level for trees, we found there was a lot of taxonomic alignment issues, even across cities in America. Like, what do they determine to be species? How do they handle things like hybrids or like sort of subspecies, or the type of Humans do a lot of like breeding for different visual characteristics in trees at the species level. And so just to try to reduce some of that complexity as we're exploring the methods, we're just predicting at the genus level. But here you can really see in those shifts in color between these cities, that's really capturing these distribution shifts. The fact that some cities have very different distributions of trees across that species set than others. And if we dig into this data set a little more, you'll see it's really expressing a lot of those characteristics I brought up at the beginning that are kind of universal to a lot of these types of problems in environmental monitoring. So the first one being that it's very long-tailed. So you'll note this is in the log scale. We've broken down the genera in the data set between frequent, common, and rare. And these cutoffs are, 10 to the 4th and then 10 to the 2nd. And really what we find is that we can do quite well and even generalize quite well on these very frequent species or genera. When you go to the common ones, we're doing okay. Down here, rare genera, the models basically cannot learn them at all. And so there's a huge amount of room for growth in this space as we're trying to understand really how do we do this well for rare species. And then we also, these data, the natural world has a taxonomy, the Linnaean taxonomy. And so we really also get to see that there's like these structured representations, these structured relationships between these different types of species. And we're very interested in how to actually capture and harness that information as we're building these models. Beyond that, we're showing that data that's multi-view. So by definition, you get ground level views and aerial views. And one of the things that I think is very interesting here is when we're thinking about environmental monitoring, these trade-offs between value and scale of data. Because aerial data, we get much broader scale. You can see every tree in a city pretty much from the air, but that data is maybe a lot harder to identify the genera of the tree from. Maybe you can get higher levels of taxonomic understanding better. And this ground level data ends up being really useful when you're trying to actually identify. So this is much sparser. We can only see some of the trees from the street. And these Google Street View cars, for example, only drive every few years in some cities. So you have like a much sparser view, but it's easier to categorize the species from that data. And I think this is really also leads to our ability to try to explore in a really interesting way those trade-offs between scale and reliability or sort of value of data, and will help us start thinking about how to better prioritize data collection in the future. And what we do find is that generally models trained on the full data set outperform city-specific or region-specific models. And that's kind of matches our intuition, like, oh, we scale up the diversity of our data set, we get better results. In some cases, that's very clear. For example, like Buffalo is a city that's quite small. There's not a lot of training data. If you train a model just for Buffalo, it performs pretty badly. Then if you move up to a regional model, like training on, all of the cities in this sort of East region, that model does pretty well. And if you then scale up to the entire sort of set of species across North America, you do get this little boost in performance. Some cities like Sioux Falls scaling up more really helps a lot. But then there are cities like Los Angeles, which is here, where actually just training on LA performs pretty much as well as scaling up training data. And then this gets into this like generality versus specificity of models question, because training on the entirety of the data set is much slower and much more expensive than if you're just training on, data from LA. And if it's not going to provide extra benefit for LA, then maybe why would the city of LA even invest in scaling up? And these types of understanding, like these types of generality, is something that I think as a field, we still have a long way to go on. Really, I think really the point is that we really want to be able to build systems that perform as well as possible for every end user, for every city. And what we don't want to do is see, like in some of these cases, where we scale up and actually we start to see performance degrade. And then finally, like again, looking at this distribution shift question and trying to dig more into maybe what these factors might be in terms of the generalization. If we break down performance, across cities. So you train on one city and test on the other for the entire sort of pairwise set. We do really start to see that there are kind of these correlations between cities that have similar distributions. And so this is actually looking at the distribution distance in a really simple way, just normalized L1 distance between like these per genus distributions for different cities. And you start to see that there are these pretty sort of characteristic patterns that you can capture, where if you actually understand how different in distribution a given city is from your underlying data set, that might actually help you predict how reliable your model might be in this new place. So trying to help cities understand, is machine learning ready for us? Or us understand whether we should release maps for given cities based on how far we think they are, either geospatially or actually just in tree distribution from the cities we've seen during training. And again, just really exploring that a little more, you'll note that, you know, not only does Los Angeles kind of perform well on itself, so it's a bit of an outlier there, it's also an outlier in terms of the number of training examples it has versus how useful it is when you're moving or trying to explore using that model in other cities. It really does not generalize well to the test sets of other cities, whereas like New York, similar order of magnitude of species, you only train on New York City, you do just about as well across the test set as if you train on every city on the West Coast. So getting at the value of our training data, I think, is also something that we really need to understand more. And we do find that combining information across views, so combining that aerial view with street level views achieves best results. But the gains from that aerial data are minimal. And if you try to predict from aerial data alone, the performance is pretty atrocious. So this kind of gets at like, you know, everyone would like to be able to build these models and be able to detect and categorize trees from only aerial data in a way that does generalize, but we have a long way to go there. And I think maybe moving forward, we should be trying to figure out how to leverage sparse but ground level, richer, more valuable data when we have it, and build systems that can try to improve on trees you can only see from the air from these heterogeneously sampled and sparser, like multimodal rich data sets on the ground. And so currently under exploration with this, we're looking at trying to incorporate LiDAR. So for now, doing better registration across these ground level views, understanding which pixels in each view correspond to the same tree to do better ensembling and reduce some of the issues we have with like multi-label, where maybe like this tree is the tree that's sort of the tree of interest in this image, but there are other trees in the background or the foreground that can be confusing to the models. We're also looking at explicit geographic and temporal context. So trying to incorporate both like seasonal changes, but also changes in space as we're predicting these species. And then something I think is very interesting as we're trying to generalize better to see species to cities that aren't seen during training. We're looking at self-supervision with cross-modal agreement. So actually, can you just think about ways to do contrastive self-supervision on the data of a new city that's just relying on the fact that you want the different views from aerial and the ground to agree about species, using that as a way to try to improve representations for now out of domain cities. And then looking at multi-label losses and loss balancing, though both of those things have proved to be, at least the sort of state of the art is not very helpful on these data sets. And we've released the data, it's open and published. You do need to kind of go through a process with signing like a data release that agrees to do takedown of any of these Street View images if someone has requested that they're taken down. Beyond that, you know, like I talked about at the beginning, there are really like these general open challenges in computer vision for ecology, for biodiversity, for the environment. These like global and local domain shift, long tail distributions, sparse, low quality, multimodal data, trying to build these interactive participatory ecologist AI or expert AI systems. And then thinking about equitable access to technology, like who can train and deploy these models, who's like able to maintain them. And along those lines, trying to grow interdisciplinary capacity, trying to build more practical computer vision knowledge across different fields of science. If you're interested in any of these things, we have a Slack channel that's got about 1,000 researchers worldwide. It's a really great community. So if you're interested in joining that community, you can email aiforconservation@gmail.com and get an invite. And then we also, sort of along those lines, we've started this summer school on computer vision methods for ecology, where we're really trying to train graduate level and postdoc level ecologists in applied computer vision for their own problems. And yeah, I'm excited about trying to think more about how we actually have an impact as a field. How do we kind of address the big challenges that we're facing? So thanks so much for having me. I'm very happy to answer questions, either more technical or high level questions. Either one is great for me.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very, very helpful and a great presentation, actually. So you have any questions for Sarah? Just let me know. You can type them in the chat and I can read them out loud for you. You can just raise your hand. I can start with a question. In terms of like other, you were saying that maybe you could expand this to other regions of the world. Like, will it just be accessing data from Google Maps and Google Street View as well? Or will you be able to like deploy campaigns about using LiDAR technology as well in other areas?
Yeah, so this is interesting. So I don't think that the methods that we're looking at are restricted to Google Street View, and a lot of the aerial data we're using is some of it's EOS, which isn't accessible everywhere on Earth. The resolution of aerial data does really impact performance, but again, something like NAPE, like there is NAPE data at 60 centimeter resolution for most of North America. That coverage, like the sort of resolution even of NAPE as you go to other parts of the world, can really degrade. So there's kind of some biases just in the data that we already have in hand that can make it challenging to move these things to other areas of the world. Beyond just data access, like I think that that's one dimension of the problem. The other dimension of the problem is just how do you build data sets that you need that sort of cover the trees that you might encounter in these areas that are representative of these areas, at least for validation and verification. Okay. So what we leveraged was cities in the US that had already paid and published tree censuses for those cities to give us this correctly labeled data to be able to train and then evaluate these models. And if you're moving to a part of the world where there's very, very little census information, then that even just like there are new species in those areas we have no training data for. There are going to inevitably be sort of visual and distribution shifts that lead to performance degradation. We want to at least be able to capture, how many of these trees are in our training data set. How well does our model perform on the trees that are expected to be identifiable based on our training data sets? So I'm really interested in scaling globally, but there are definitely some limitations in the way. And what I'm trying to do now is actually, can we really scale up to every city in North America, not just the wealthy ones that were sort of able to collect this information, where now it's kind of, at least we'd expect most of those trees to be trees that we've actually already seen. And then going from there, how do we expand? What is actually the process that you would do to efficiently determine what you need to do to retrain? Do you need to retrain? What can you use already? All of that stuff.
Cool. We have a raised hand from Islam.
Hi. Hey, great talk. Thank you for sharing all of these great work. So I have a question related to domain generalization. So which AI, have you tried different AI models to generalize across domains from a technical perspective? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I was a pretty active collaborator when we were building out things like the WILDS benchmark data set, really trying to get at the fact that actually most of our state-of-the-art methods for domain generalization in AI have really been built on fake problems. It's things like, can we generalize from cityscapes to foggy cityscapes, where we've literally just taken cityscapes and then added fake fog on top. In a lot of ways, those kind of toy problems have not been capturing the complexity of domain generalization in the real world. So with that WILDS benchmark, and if you haven't looked at it, I think it's great. I'm pretty proud of that work. really took a bunch of different types of applications and captured realistic kind of real world domain shifts that you would expect to see in practice. And what we found is that, unfortunately, when you go to the real world, a lot of these modern methods don't outperform ERM, don't outperform just basic empirical risk minimization. And there's actually been some really cool work recently, I think, that's looking into kind of almost like domain shift diagnostics and almost prescription, because there are some methods that seem to work well for visual shift, like actually the distribution across the classes isn't changing, but what something looks like shifts. And then there's other methods that seem to be doing pretty well with subpopulation shift, like actually explicitly tackling what happens if, in this area, this species is common and this one's rare, and now you're switching to a new area. But a lot of real world problems have some combination of the two. And so now it's like, how do you really think about what method is going to work best for you in some of these areas? Some cases, we've seen some pretty nice results with things like DAN or Coral, some of these like, how do you kind of get the model to ignore the differences between the domains and build sort of feature representations that are shared. But in some cases, those things actually hurt us. So what is useful context and like usable context we might actually want to capture versus what do we want to be invariant to, I think is kind of like a meta challenge that we have to figure out.
So there is no universal solution, depends solely on the data you're having, right? And
and algorithmic solutions don't really help that much. Like even if we do have like a really cool, super great math algorithmic solution, like you get like a couple % of improvement. But in practice, like what does that really mean for a user? So again, like coming what I was saying at the beginning, like we should really just be trying. I mean, I know it's frustrating when you build a method and it like helps a little, and that will help you get a paper into NeurIPS, but like what does that really mean in practice? Like how much are we really addressing the challenges? It's hard to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Slem. Do you have any questions for Sarah? I was going to ask you, like, in terms of, can you hear me? Yeah. Ask in terms of like the amount of data that you can handle for this. Like, does it matter if like the town that you want to assess is very small or just like a specific county of LA, and can it be the whole city or like the whole of California straight away? Like, how does it? Is there any scalability issues?
I mean, on the engineering side, sometimes, like, I mean, if you're talking about training or evaluating on much more data, then often you want to implement some sort of parallelization. That's something that's more possible within the constraints of a company like Google than it is as an academic. Which, I mean, I won't say that that's not true. But also, I think particularly as we're seeing like these pretty powerful representation, like sort of representation learning systems, like things like CLIP, where you're sort of learning on sometimes the entire internet worth of data. Those are really exciting. They tend to be very large and very difficult to figure out how to fine tune. And I actually think that that is an area of research that seems really exciting to me. Like, how do we do specialization from these like very large, kind of very expensive representation learning systems to like specific problems? And one of the things that we really have seen just experimentally is that those models trained sort of from descriptors or images on the internet, they tend not to be very good at understanding fine-grained differences. So things like tree species ID, like it's really good at putting all the representations of trees in one place, and it's not very good at actually building separable sort of like lower than the taxonomic category of tree, or even maybe just like palm tree versus pine tree versus like deciduous tree. It tends to kind of make a mess of those fine-grained categories. So can we actually figure out how to work from these powerful representations and get at fine-grained problems, I think is a cool area of future work. And then also the specialization thing. So is it actually better? Like, say I really just want the best map I can possibly get for Santa Barbara. What's the process? Like, actually, should we be like sort of sub-sampling out of all the training data we have access to and kind of trying to create like the optimal training data set for Santa Barbara? Do you train on everything and then try to do some lightweight specialization at the end? Do you actually just do something like look at the distribution of trees in Santa Barbara, try to do distribution testing or estimation of what that would be, and then take a Bayesian step over the logits at the end to try to just shift the probabilities to match what you see in Santa Barbara? There's like a lot of different ways that you can think about specialization, and there's trade-offs between the few of each of them. All right.
Yep. Thank you. And I think a follow-up question to that, like in terms of building like that good data set, like when is like the best time of the year to like take this?
When the leaves are on.
Because I was thinking,
when the leaves are off, it's really hard actually to identify, even for experts, right? Leaf off is very difficult. And if you're talking about even just that, like what does tend to generalize pretty well are things like detection. So just detecting trees across the class set or detecting animals across different parts of the world. Detection, in practice, detection generalizes better than classification, in my experience, particularly when the classification problem is long-tailed. Tree canopy estimation, like generalizes pretty well, but it really struggles with leaf off, right? So if you've taken aerial imagery from the winter, or if you're in a part of the world, like the further north you go, the more time of the year, maybe deciduous trees don't have leaves, you start to get like, it's just very difficult to recognize tree canopy when the leaves are off.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so maybe like the data sets will be kind of around summer, springtime.
Yeah, well, ideally, but what we're really looking at here is trying to get environmental information as bycatch out of data that was collected for a different purpose, right? And I think that that's really powerful if you can do it effectively. So Google Street View data or EOS data is often collected by a city, not to study their trees, but to study their buildings or their cars or their streets.
Yeah.
And then so we kind of have to take what we get. And then what we're trying to do is like, all right, but we've already paid to collect that data. So now can we also extract environmental insight or like urban ecosystem insight from it? Which means we do have cases where the data's in the winter and then the performance is just worse.
Okay, yeah, I understand. Cool. Yeah. It's a very interesting problem, actually.
Yeah, I agree. I might be biased though.
Does anyone else have any more questions for Sarah? Yep.
Yeah, Claire.
Claire, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, thanks. Just trying to unmute and everything. I wondered if you knew if anyone is working on this data for carbon sequestration or water retention at the moment, or are you working on it?
I'm not. I think it'd be quite cool if people did. I think that so there's some interesting things about the way we formulated this data that like lends itself to like fine-grained like detection classification problems, or even maybe more just the classification problem than sort of large-scale carbon sequestration. So we've explicitly taken every known location of tree and then built like a, taken all these different views looking at that tree. But when that doesn't enable is you to then say, okay, now if I build something on this, the next step is now I want to run it over an entire city, right? So like all of the aerial imagery instead of just the aerial imagery of street trees. So I think there's like maybe one step past this data set in terms of just like engineering effort that you would need to do to be able to like try to estimate water from, all of the canopy. But I do know that I think it's like you could use this to start trying to get at that problem. Because if you know what the species are and you have this different imagery of it, then you try to learn something that directly predicts something like water retention, then you could try to scale that up and try to evaluate those estimates.
Yeah.
I guess my question for you would be like, I don't know if you are working in those spaces, like what I often ask domain experts, what would convince you that a water retention or carbon sequestration model is good?
Well, I don't work in that field actually
Yeah.
at all. So I was just interested if you could actually take these models and use them already for these kind of applications, thinking more generally.
I think that there's one layer further of abstraction if you want to like build a map for an entire region.
Yeah.
Versus the tree specific models that we're building. But also, yeah, again, how do you know if the model's good? I think that that's like something I think about a lot, and good enough because they have models that do that already, but they also, everyone who builds them knows that they're kind of crap, particularly at like small like sort of specific resolutions or specific, like, you know, spatially kind of crap. So maybe better, but like, how do you know?
Good question. Yeah, great. Thanks. Very nice talk. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, I think we can, if there's no more questions, I think we can leave up to here. Like, yeah, thank you, Sarah, for sharing your time and showing us your work. And it was a great talk.
Thank you. See you guys.
Yeah,
please join the Slack or reach out if you're interested, for sure.
Cool.
Bye.
Bye-bye.